November 22nd, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. Camp Aliceville, Alabama, sat in darkness except for one building blazing with electric light. The camp kitchen. Obergefreiter Hans Müller pressed his face against the cold barracks window, watching American cooks haul crates from supply trucks. Even at this distance, he could identify the shapes: potatoes, onions, what looked like massive frozen birds. "What are they doing?" asked Fritz Weber from the bunk below. Hans didn't answer immediately. In his previous life, he had managed the Gasthaus Müller in Hamburg's Altstadt district. He knew kitchen operations. What he was witnessing made no sense. "Preparing for something," Hans said finally. "Something big." By 6 o'clock, a dozen German prisoners had gathered at the windows. The Americans weren't trying to hide their activity. If anything, they seemed to want the Germans to watch. Sergeant James Washington emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a black man from Georgia, one of the few American soldiers who spoke broken German. He looked directly at the barracks windows and smiled. "This is psychological warfare," Hans muttered. "They want us to see abundance we cannot have." A younger prisoner, Wilhelm Schmidt, pressed closer to the glass. "Herr Müller, look at the size of those birds. Are those geese?" "Turkeys," Hans corrected automatically. "American turkeys, 20 pounds each, maybe more." Fritz climbed down from his bunk. Why would they prepare such food for us? Hans turned away from the window, his jaw set. "They wouldn't. This is theatre, a performance designed to break our spirit." But even as he spoke, doubt flickered in his mind. Hans Müller had been a prisoner at Camp Aliceville for 7 months, long enough to understand the rhythm of American military operations, long enough to recognize patterns, and long enough to know when something didn't fit. At 38, he was among the oldest prisoners in the compound. Most were boys in their early 20s, captured during the Normandy invasion or the subsequent retreat across France. Hans had been taken near Aachen in October of 1943, part of a supply unit that stumbled into an American advance. Before the war, the Gasthaus Müller had been a respected establishment in Hamburg's Altstadt. 3 generations of Müllers had run it. Hans's grandfather had built the reputation. His father had maintained it. Hans had been preparing to inherit it when conscription papers arrived in 1942. He'd served as a quartermaster, managing food supplies for Wehrmacht units. The irony wasn't lost on him, a restaurant manager reduced to distributing tinned meat and stale bread to hungry soldiers. But he'd done his duty. That's what Germans did. Camp Aliceville was cleaner than he'd expected, better organized. The Americans followed their Geneva Convention rules with almost obsessive precision. Adequate food, medical care, recreation time, male privileges. It was all very correct, very professional. Too correct, Hans thought sometimes. Too professional. He'd organized what he called the Resistance Committee during his 3rd month of captivity. Not a resistance in any military sense, those days were over, but a resistance of dignity, of refusing to be seduced by American comfort, of maintaining German identity in the face of enemy hospitality. The committee established informal rules. Prisoners could work in camp operations that was required, but they should maintain distance from American personnel. Polite but cold. Correct but never friendly. Accept what was given but never ask for more. And never, under any circumstances, appear grateful. Younger prisoners sometimes complained. Wilhelm Schmidt, that boy who was always in the kitchen talking to the Negro cook, had called Hans unnecessarily rigid just last week. Hans had responded simply, "The Americans want us to forget we're prisoners. I'm making sure we remember." Now, watching the inexplicable food preparation, Hans felt his carefully constructed framework wobbling. The Americans were planning something, a feast of some kind, but for what purpose? He'd spent the morning asking questions. No one knew. Not even the guards seemed to understand why he was concerned. "It's just Thanksgiving," one had said, as if that explained anything. Hans had nodded politely and walked away, more suspicious than ever. November 23rd, 1944, 8 o'clock in the morning. Captain William Bradford stood before the assembled German prisoners in the parade ground, his breath visible in the cold Alabama air. Behind him, the American flag snapped in the wind. "Gentlemen," he began in careful German, reading from a prepared statement. "Tomorrow is Thanksgiving, an important American holiday. The United States Army has authorized a special meal to be shared with prisoners of war in accordance with the spirit of this tradition." Hans stood in the third row, arms crossed. Around him, prisoners shifted uncertainly. "Thanksgiving dinner will be served tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon," Captain Bradford continued. "All prisoners are invited to attend. The meal will include roasted turkey, traditional side dishes, and dessert. This is not a work detail. This is an invitation." The word "invited" hung in the air strangely. Prisoners weren't invited to things. They were ordered or assigned or detailed. Fritz leaned close to Hans. "What does this mean?" Hans's jaw tightened. He raised his hand. "Yes, Obergefreiter Müller." "Captain Bradford, sir, with respect, we do not understand this invitation. Are we required to attend?" Bradford seemed to consider the question carefully. "No, Müller, you are not required. Any prisoner who chooses not to attend may remain in the barracks. Regular evening rations will be available for those who decline." A murmur rippled through the assembled prisoners. "However," Bradford added, "I encourage you to attend. Thanksgiving is about gratitude and shared humanity. We're offering you a place at the table." Hans felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't generosity. This was something worse. This was an attempt to make them complicit, to make them grateful, to transform them from proud German soldiers into supplicants accepting charity from their captors. After dismissal, Hans gathered the resistance committee in the barracks. 12 men, ranging from Fritz Weber at 42 to young Klaus Zimmermann at 20. "This is a test," Hans said. "They want to see who breaks first, who forgets they're a prisoner, who trades dignity for turkey." Fritz nodded slowly. "So, we refuse?" "We refuse," Hans confirmed. "All of us." By noon, word of the boycott had spread through the camp. Hans stood on his bunk in Barracks 7, addressing nearly 40 German prisoners who had crowded inside. "Listen carefully," Hans said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had managed staff in peacetime. "The Americans are clever. They don't beat us. They don't starve us. Instead, they try to make us forget who we are." "But Hans," interrupted a young soldier named Peter Hoffman, "it's just a meal." "No," Hans said sharply, "it's never just a meal. Food is how they break us down. First, we accept their turkey, then we thank them for it. Then, we begin to think of them as generous, as friends. Before we know it, we've forgotten we're prisoners of war. We've forgotten Germany." Fritz stood near the door, arms crossed. "Hans is right. I've seen it happen. Men who arrive proud, who leave speaking English and talking about staying in America after the war. That won't be us," Hans continued. "Tomorrow, when they serve their Thanksgiving feast, we will remain in the barracks. We will eat our regular rations. We will maintain our dignity." Klaus Zimmermann, barely 21, raised his hand hesitantly. "But Herr Müller, if we refuse, won't that anger them? Won't there be consequences?" "That's what they want you to think," Hans replied. But Captain Bradford said attendance was optional. "If we refuse as a group, they can't punish us without violating their own Geneva Convention rules. They've trapped themselves with their own fairness." A murmur of agreement rippled through the barracks. "I'm asking each of you to make a choice," Hans said, his voice softening slightly. "Not for me, not even for Germany, but for yourselves. When this war ends and you return home, will you be able to say you maintained your honor? Or will you have to admit you were bought with American turkey?" One by one, hands went up. Within 20 minutes, Hans had commitments from 37 prisoners to boycott the Thanksgiving dinner. But not everyone agreed. Wilhelm Schmidt stood at the back of the barracks, silent throughout Hans's speech. When the meeting ended and prisoners filed out, Willy remained. "You disagree," Hans said. "It wasn't a question." "I think you're making a mistake," Willy replied quietly. "Sergeant Washington has been teaching me English. He's told me about Thanksgiving. It's not about showing off abundance. It's about their history, their culture. They're trying to share something meaningful with us." "And you believe him?" "I believe he's been honest with me. More honest than our own officers were about how the war was going." Hans felt anger flash through him. "So you'll attend their dinner? 18-6. "I haven't decided," Willy said, "but I won't let fear of what other prisoners think make my decision for me." After Willy left, Hans sat alone on his bunk. The boy's words bothered him more than he wanted to admit. What if this wasn't psychological warfare? What if the Americans genuinely meant their invitation as a gesture of, what, goodwill? Humanity? Hans shook his head. No, that way led to collaboration, to forgetting, to becoming something other than what he was. Tomorrow he would stay in the barracks, and he would prove that German dignity couldn't be bought with food, no matter how skillfully prepared. November 23rd, 1944, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Hans was reviewing the boycott list when Wilhelm Schmidt entered the barracks. Behind him came Sergeant James Washington, carrying a wooden crate filled with cooking supplies. The conversation in the room stopped immediately. "Willy," Hans said carefully, "what is this?" Sergeant Washington set the crate down near the door. "Afternoon, gentlemen. Private Schmidt here has been helping me prepare some of the Thanksgiving dishes. Wanted to show him proper technique for cornbread dressing. Thought some of you might be interested in seeing how we do things in Georgia." Hans stood slowly. "Private Schmidt has been helping you?" "Yes, sir," Willy said, his German formal but defiant. "For the past 3 weeks. Sergeant Washington has been teaching me American cooking methods in exchange for me teaching him German recipes. My grandmother's sauerbraten, actually." Fritz moved closer, his expression troubled. "Willy, we discussed this. The resistance committee agreed." "I didn't agree to anything." Willy interrupted. "I attended one meeting. I listened. But I never signed up for your committee, Hans. I never took an oath to boycott American kindness." The room went very quiet. Hans felt the eyes of every prisoner on him. This was the moment that would determine whether his boycott held or collapsed. If he handled it wrong, if he appeared tyrannical rather than principled, he would lose the moral authority he'd spent months building. "You're free to make your own choices," Hans said, keeping his voice level. "We all are. But I must ask in front of everyone, are you attending the Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow?" Willy met his gaze without flinching. "Yes." A collective intake of breath rippled through the barracks. "Then you're a collaborator," said Klaus Zimmermann from his bunk. "You're betraying German soldiers." "I'm eating a meal," Willy shot back. "I'm not signing up for the American army. I'm not giving away military secrets. I'm accepting an invitation to dinner from people who have treated me decently for 7 months." "They're the enemy," Peter Hoffmann said. "They were the enemy," Willy corrected. "The war is still happening, yes, but we're not soldiers anymore. We're prisoners. And they're following every rule about how to treat us. More than following, they're exceeding the rules." Hans raised his hand for silence. "Willy, I understand your position, but you must understand mine. If we accept their generosity, we become obligated to them. Gratitude creates debt. Debt creates loyalty. Before you know it, you're no longer thinking like a German soldier, but like an American friend." "Maybe," Willy said quietly, "that wouldn't be the worst thing." The words hung in the air like a grenade. Sergeant Washington, who had been standing silently by the door throughout the confrontation, finally spoke in his careful German. "Gentlemen, I don't want to cause division among you. Private Schmidt can stop helping in the kitchen if this is creating problems. That's not what we want. No, Hans interrupted. Let him help. Let him attend your dinner. We don't force anyone in the resistance committee. We only ask that those who go remember they represent more than themselves. They represent German dignity. Willie nodded slowly. I'll remember, Hans, but I'll also remember that Sergeant Washington shared his rations with me when I had dysentery last month, and that he wrote a letter to my mother in Hamburg telling her I was alive and healthy. Those things matter too. After they left, the barracks erupted in argument. Some prisoners sided with Hans, calling Willie weak and susceptible to American manipulation. Others questioned whether the boycott was worth dividing the camp over a single meal. Hans sat on his bunk, watching his carefully constructed resistance begin to fracture, and the dinner was still 25 hours away. November 23rd, 1944. 6 o'clock in the evening. The smell started drifting across the camp just after sunset. Hans was lying on his bunk, trying to read a month-old German newspaper when he noticed it. Rich, savoury, unlike anything the camp kitchen normally produced. Around him, other prisoners stirred, noses lifted, conversations paused. Is that butter? Fritz asked from across the aisle. And herbs, Hans said, despite himself. Sage, maybe, thyme. The scent grew stronger as evening deepened. Hans could identify individual components. Now his professional training wouldn't let him ignore them. Roasting meat, onions caramelizing, something sweet baking, possibly with cinnamon. By 7 o'clock, prisoners were gathering at the barracks windows again, looking toward the kitchen. Smoke rose from the chimneys in steady columns. They're preparing it tonight? Peter Hoffmann asked. For tomorrow? The turkeys need to roast slowly, Hans heard himself explain. Probably 14 hours for birds that size. They'll finish them in the morning. Klaus Zimmermann appeared at Hans's bunk. Herr Müller, some of the men are asking questions about the boycott. What kind of questions? Whether we're required to stay in the barracks all day tomorrow, or if we could just be outside, near the mess hall, in case we change our minds. Hans closed his eyes. The smell of roasting turkey filled his lungs. 21 hours until dinner. November 24th, 1944. 7 o'clock in the morning. Hans woke to chaos. The barracks door banged open. Klaus Zimmermann stood there, breathless. Herr Müller, you need to see this. Hans pulled on his boots and followed Klaus outside into the cold morning air. A crowd of German prisoners had gathered near the fence, separating the barracks from the main camp facilities. Beyond the fence, the kitchen courtyard had transformed overnight. Long tables stretched across the open space, covered with white cloths that snapped in the morning breeze. American soldiers were setting out chairs, dozens of them. A makeshift stage had been erected at one end, decorated with autumn leaves and cornstalks. They're setting up outside, Fritz said, appearing beside Hans. Not in the mess hall, outside, where everyone can see. Hans watched Captain Bradford directing the setup, pointing to table arrangements, adjusting decorations. The man moved with the focused energy of someone organizing something important. How many tables? Hans asked. I count 12, Peter Hoffmann said. Maybe 15 people per table. That's space for everyone, Hans finished quietly. Every prisoner in the camp. The smell from the kitchen was overwhelming now. Hans could identify everything. Turkey, obviously, but also sweet potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, something with cranberries, pumpkin. His professional palate catalogued each scent automatically. Hans, Fritz said carefully, some of the men want to talk to you. They gathered behind Barracks 7, away from the main crowd. 8 prisoners from the resistance committee. Klaus spoke first. Herr Müller, we've been discussing the situation. The Americans aren't hiding this feast. They're displaying it, making it public. That's the point, Hans said. Maximum psychological impact. Maybe, said Peter. Or maybe they genuinely want to share their tradition with us. Hans turned sharply. You're wavering. I'm thinking, Peter corrected, which is different. They didn't have to set up outside in the cold. The mess hall would have been easier, warmer. But they're making this something special, something inclusive. They're making it theatre, Hans insisted, but his voice sounded less certain than yesterday. Fritz cleared his throat. Hans, I need to ask you something as a friend. Are we boycotting because it's the right thing to do, or because you committed to it publicly and can't back down without losing face? The question hit Hans like a physical blow. That's not fair. It's completely fair, Fritz interrupted. I'll follow you either way. We all will, but you need to be honest about your motives. Is this about German dignity or your dignity? Hans opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Across the fence, American soldiers were testing a microphone. In 6 hours, the dinner would begin. And Hans still didn't know what he was going to do. November 24th, 1944, 11 o'clock in the morning. Hans was alone in the barracks when Sergeant Washington appeared at the door. Obergefreiter Müller, the sergeant said in his careful German. May I have a word? Hans stood slowly, wary. Of course, Sergeant. Washington stepped inside, removing his cap. The gesture felt oddly formal. I understand you've organized a boycott of the Thanksgiving dinner. That's correct. May I ask why? Hans considered lying, deflecting. But something about Washington's direct gaze made evasion seem pointless. Because accepting your hospitality makes us complicit. It transforms us from prisoners into guests. That's dangerous for German morale. Washington nodded thoughtfully. That's honest. I respect that. He paused. But I'd like to make you an offer. Not to attend the dinner, I understand your position on that. But to come to the kitchen now, as a professional. I don't understand. Private Schmidt tells me you managed a restaurant in Hamburg. 3 generations of family tradition. That true? Yes. Then come see how we're preparing this meal. Not as a prisoner, not as a guest, as one cook observing another cook's work. Professional to professional. Hans felt his resistance waver. Why would you want me to see your kitchen? Washington smiled slightly. Because Private Schmidt also tells me you think this whole thing is psychological warfare, that we're showing off abundance to break your spirit. He met Hans's eyes. I want you to see that we're just cooking Thanksgiving dinner. Same way my grandmother cooked it in Georgia. Same way Americans have cooked it for over 100 years. Nothing more complicated than that. And if I refuse? Then you refuse. No consequences. But, Obergefreiter Müller, I think you're curious. I think the professional part of you wants to see how we prepare a 20-pound turkey, how we make dressing, how we get the giblet gravy just right. He was right, and Hans hated that he was right. 15 minutes, Hans said. I'll observe your kitchen for 15 minutes. Then I return to the barracks. Fair enough. The kitchen was controlled chaos. 3 cooks worked at different stations, one basting turkeys, another preparing side dishes, a third rolling out pie dough. The organization impressed Hans immediately. Each station had its mise en place properly arranged. No wasted movement, no confusion, no shouting. Just the quiet efficiency of professionals who knew their craft. Sergeant Miller, Washington, called to the man basting turkeys. Show Obergefreiter Müller your technique. Miller, a burly man with flour dusting his apron, demonstrated without speaking. He pulled a massive bird from the oven, tilted the roasting pan to collect drippings, and used a bulb baster to coat the turkey with its own juices mixed with butter. Every 30 minutes, Miller said in English. Washington translated. Keeps the breast meat from drying out. Hans found himself leaning closer, studying the bird's golden brown colour. The skin is perfect, mahogany brown. You must have. He stopped himself. Must have what? Washington prompted. You must have started with a butter rub, under the skin, before roasting. It's the only way to get that color and keep the meat moist. Miller grinned and said something in English. Washington translated. He says, "You know your business, sir." Hans stood in the American kitchen, surrounded by enemy soldiers, and felt his carefully constructed worldview beginning to crack. November 24th, 1944, 11:30 in the morning. Hans's 15 minutes stretched to 30, then 45. Washington walked him through each station, explaining techniques with the pride of someone sharing cultural knowledge rather than military superiority. At the vegetable station, a young private named Carson demonstrated how to make green bean casserole with cream of mushroom soup and crispy onions. "This is new," Washington explained. "Recipe came out a few years ago from a soup company. Now it's becoming traditional." Watching to mind, this is new one recipe. Hans watched Carson layer the ingredients with practiced efficiency. "You're creating new traditions while we—" He stopped himself. "While you what?" Washington asked quietly. "While we were trying to preserve old ones through force." Hans hadn't meant to say it aloud. They moved to the sweet potato station. Sergeant Miller was preparing candied yams, coating orange slices with butter, brown sugar, and a spice Hans couldn't immediately identify. "Nutmeg?" Hans asked. "And cinnamon. Some folks use marshmallows on top, but we keep it simple." Hans nodded, his professional assessment overriding his political reservations. "The sugar will caramelize at high heat, creates depth of flavor, good technique." Miller said something in English. Washington translated, "He says his mother's recipe came from her mother, who was enslaved in Virginia before the war." Hans felt the weight of that statement. This black sergeant was sharing a recipe passed down through generations that included slavery, and he was sharing it with a German prisoner whose country had tried to implement its own version of racial hierarchy. "I don't know what to say to that," Hans admitted. "Don't need to say anything," Washington replied. "Just understand that food carries history, sometimes painful history. But we still cook it, still share it, because that's how we remember and honor where we came from." They reached the final station, the turkeys themselves. 6 massive birds rested on a preparation table, their skin glistening with butter and herbs. Miller opened an oven to reveal 4 more, roasting to perfection. 10 turkeys, Hans calculated automatically. That's over 200 pounds of meat. With sides, that's enough to feed every prisoner in this camp, plus all American personnel, Washington finished. "We're eating together today, not prisoners and guards, just people sharing a meal." Hans stared at the turkeys. In Germany, this much meat would feed a city block for a week. Here, you're using it for 1 meal. "America has resources," Washington acknowledged. "We're lucky that way, but Thanksgiving isn't about showing off what we have. It's about being grateful for it. And sharing it. Even with your enemies? Especially with our enemies, because maybe if we break bread together, we stop being enemies." Hans picked up a basting brush, examining its construction with professional interest. It was well made, practical, like everything else in this kitchen. No waste, no ostentation. Just competent preparation of traditional dishes. "Sergeant Washington," Hans said slowly, "when you invited me here, you said this wasn't psychological warfare, but this is more effective than any propaganda. You're showing me that America isn't what I was told, that Americans aren't what I believed." "Is that warfare?" Washington asked, "or just truth?" Hans set down the basting brush. "I don't know anymore." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of kitchen work surrounding them, timers chiming, pots bubbling, the occasional clatter of utensils. It was the same soundscape Hans remembered from his restaurant in Hamburg, before the war consumed everything normal about German life. "My 15 minutes are up," Hans said finally. "They've been up for half an hour," Washington replied with a slight smile. "But you're welcome to stay longer." "No, I need to. Hans struggled to articulate what he needed to do. Think, process, reconsider everything he'd built his boycott around. I need to return to the barracks. Understood, but Obergefreiter Müller, the invitation to dinner still stands, for you and every man in your committee. No pressure, no judgment either way. Hans nodded and walked toward the door. As he reached it, he turned back. That technique Müller is using, the butter under the skin, in Germany. We did that with goose at Christmas, before the war. See, Washington said, we're not so different, are we? Hans left the kitchen without answering. But the question followed him across the compound, back to the barracks, where 37 men were waiting to hear whether their leader still believed in the boycott he'd organized. And Hans still didn't know what he was going to tell them. November 24th, 1944, noon. Hans sat on his bunk, staring at his hands. They smelled like butter and herbs from the kitchen. He'd washed them twice, but the scent remained. The barracks was empty. Most prisoners were outside, watching the final preparations for the dinner. Only Fritz remained, sitting across from Hans, in silence. Tell me what you saw, Fritz said finally. Hans described the kitchen, the organization, the technique, the care put into every dish, and most troubling of all, the genuine hospitality in Washington's explanation of each tradition. He wasn't showing off, Hans said quietly. He was sharing. There's a difference. Yes, Fritz agreed, there is. I built the boycott on the assumption that this was psychological warfare, that they were using abundance as a weapon to break our morale. And now? Now I think they're just cooking Thanksgiving dinner, the way they always have, the way they would whether we were here or not. Fritz leaned back against the wall. So, what do we do? Hans stood and walked to the window. Outside, prisoners were gathering near the fence, watching American soldiers carry steaming dishes to the tables. The smell of roasted turkey drifted through the barracks windows. I told 37 men not to attend, Hans said. I convinced them it was a matter of German dignity, of resistance, of maintaining our identity as soldiers rather than becoming grateful prisoners. Were you wrong? Hans turned to face Fritz. I don't know. Maybe maintaining dignity doesn't require refusing kindness. Maybe resistance isn't the same as stubbornness. Maybe, he stopped, frustrated. I don't know what I believe anymore. The men are waiting for your decision, Fritz said. Whatever you choose, most of them will follow. That's what frightens me. What if I'm wrong again? What if attending is collaboration? What if refusing is just pride disguised as principle? Fritz stood and joined Hans at the window. Let me ask you something different. If you weren't the leader of the resistance committee, if you had no responsibility to anyone else, what would you do? Hans closed his eyes. The honest answer came immediately, even though he didn't want to admit it. I'd go, he said quietly. Not because I'm hungry, not even because the food is expertly prepared, but because Washington invited me as a professional, as someone who understands what it means to honor food and tradition. He treated me like a colleague, not a prisoner. Then perhaps that's your answer. But the others are adults, Fritz interrupted. They can make their own decisions. You organized the boycott based on what you believed at the time. Now you believe something different. Tell them that. Let them choose. Hans looked at his watch. 2:45 in the afternoon. 15 minutes until dinner service began. And if they think I've been corrupted by American hospitality, then they think that, Fritz said simply. But at least you'll be honest, which is more than the people who sent us to war were. Hans nodded slowly. Fritz was right. He'd built his resistance on incomplete information. Now he had better information. Maintaining a position he no longer believed in wasn't integrity, it was cowardice. Gather the committee, Hans said. All of them. I need to talk to them before the dinner starts. November 24th, 1944, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The resistance committee gathered behind Barracks 7. 37 men, ranging from Fritz Weber at 42 to young Klaus Zimmermann at 20. They stood in a rough semicircle, faces tense with anticipation. Hans stood before them, feeling the weight of leadership more heavily than ever before. "I went to the kitchen this morning," he began. "Sergeant Washington invited me to observe their preparation as a professional. I accepted." A murmur ran through the group. Peter Hoffmann stepped forward. "And what did you see?" "I saw cooks preparing traditional dishes with skill and care. I saw 10 turkeys being roasted using techniques any professional would respect. I saw a black sergeant sharing his grandmother's recipe, a recipe that survived slavery, and I saw Americans preparing to share their most important holiday with us." "So they won you over," Klaus said bitterly. "They showed you abundance, and you forgot why we're boycotting." Hans met the young man's eyes. "They didn't win me over. They showed me I was wrong about their motives." The silence that followed was heavy. "I organized this boycott because I believed the Americans were using food as psychological warfare." Hans continued, "I thought they were displaying abundance to break our morale, to make us forget we're prisoners, to corrupt us with comfort." "And now," Fritz prompted quietly, "now I think they're just celebrating Thanksgiving. It's not about us at all. It's about their tradition. And they're inviting us to participate because that's what the holiday means to them, gratitude and sharing." "That's exactly what they want you to think," Peter said. "That's how propaganda works, Hans. They make you believe it's genuine." "Maybe," Hans acknowledged. "Or maybe not everything is propaganda. Maybe sometimes kindness is just kindness." Klaus shook his head. "So you're attending the dinner?" "Yes," Hans said simply. "I am." The fracture was immediate and visible. Some men nodded, clearly relieved. Others stepped back, faces hardening with disapproval. "Then you're no longer speaking for this committee," Klaus said. "You're speaking for yourself." "I was always speaking for myself," Hans replied. "I organized the boycott based on what I believed. Now I believe something different. Each of you must make your own choice." "Easy for you to say," Peter countered. "You're not the one who'll be called a collaborator. The rest of us have to live with whatever decision we make." "We all have to live with our decisions," Hans said. "But I'd rather live with the decision I made honestly than the one I made from pride." Rebrais, Selve A. Fritz stepped forward. "Hans is right. He organized the boycott based on incomplete information. Now he has better information. That's not weakness, that's intelligence." "It's surrender," Klaus insisted. "We came here as German soldiers. We should leave as German soldiers, not as grateful prisoners who accepted American charity." "Is it charity?" Hans asked. "Or is it hospitality? Is there a difference between accepting what's freely offered and becoming obligated to those who offer it?" "There's always an obligation," Peter said. "That's how these things work." Hans looked around at the gathered men. Some were clearly wrestling with the decision. Others had already made up their minds one way or the other. "I'm not ordering anyone to attend," Hans said. "I'm not even encouraging it. I'm simply telling you that I'm going, and I'm explaining why. What you do with that information is your choice." "How many are going?" Klaus demanded, looking around at the committee members. Slowly, hands began to rise. Fritz first, then 5 others, then 3 more after a pause. Finally, 12 men out of 37 had indicated they would attend. 25 are still holding firm, Klaus said, turning to the group who hadn't raised their hands. "We maintain the boycott. We show the Americans that not all Germans can be bought with turkey." "This isn't about being bought," Hans said quietly. "It's about being open to the possibility that we were wrong." "No," Klaus said firmly. "It's about maintaining dignity in captivity, and some of us still remember what that means." He turned and walked away, followed by most of the men who hadn't raised their hands. Hans watched them go, feeling his committee split apart. 2:30 in the afternoon, 30 minutes until dinner. November 24th, 1944, 2:30 in the afternoon. Hans stood alone in the barracks, watching through the window as prisoners began moving toward the outdoor tables. Some walked with purpose. Others hesitated, looking back toward the barracks where the boycotters remained. He could see Wilhelm Schmidt already seated, talking animatedly with Sergeant Washington. The young man looked relaxed. Happy, even. Hans touched the window glass, his hand leaving a faint print. In Hamburg, the Gasthaus Müller would be rubble now. 3 generations of tradition erased by bombs. His father was dead. His mother's last letter, 6 months ago, had mentioned starvation rations. And here he stood, about to eat roasted turkey. The guilt was crushing. But so was the alternative, clinging to pride while rejecting an honest gesture of humanity. He turned from the window. Time to walk to the mess hall. November 24th, 1944, 2:45 in the afternoon. Hans stepped out of the barracks into the cold Alabama afternoon. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. He buttoned his jacket and began walking toward the outdoor dining area. He wasn't alone. Fritz emerged from Barrack 7, followed by the 11 others who had raised their hands. They fell into step beside Hans without speaking, forming a loose group that moved with the uncertain energy of men who had made a difficult decision and were now committed to seeing it through. From other barracks, prisoners who hadn't been part of the resistance committee were also emerging. Young men eager for a good meal, older prisoners who had simply ignored Hans's boycott altogether. Wilhelm Schmidt waved from one of the tables, gesturing for them to join him. Hans was acutely aware of the eyes watching from barracks windows, Klaus and the 24 others who had chosen to maintain the boycott. He could feel their judgment like physical weight on his shoulders. "Don't look back," Fritz murmured beside him. "You made your choice honestly. That's all any man can do." As they approached the dining area, Hans took in the full scope of the preparation. 12 long tables, each set with real plates and cutlery, white tablecloths snapping in the breeze. American soldiers and German prisoners, already seated together, engaged in halting conversations aided by hand gestures and broken language. Captain Bradford stood near the entrance, greeting prisoners as they arrived. When he saw Hans, his expression shifted to something like respect. "Obergefreiter Müller," he said in his careful German, "I'm glad you decided to join us." "I'm not certain it's the right decision," Hans replied honestly, "but it's an honest one. That's all we can ask for." Sergeant Washington appeared, guiding Hans's group to a table near the center of the dining area. Hans found himself seated between Fritz and a young American private who introduced himself as Tommy Carson from Kentucky. "You speak German?" Hans asked in English. "Not a word, sir," Carson replied cheerfully, "but I figure we can manage. Food's a universal language, right?" Before Hans could respond, the serving began. American soldiers and German prisoners working together carried platters to each table. And then Hans saw what had been prepared. The turkeys, golden brown and glistening, were carved at serving stations. Each bird yielded perfectly sliced white and dark meat. Alongside came the dishes Hans had seen in preparation. Candied sweet potatoes gleaming with caramelized sugar, green beans in cream sauce, mashed potatoes with butter pooling in the center, cranberry sauce that caught the light like rubies, cornbread dressing fragrant with sage, and fresh rolls still warm from the oven. Hans stared at his empty plate, suddenly unable to move. This was more food than he'd seen on a single table since before the war. More abundance than existed in all of Germany at this moment, and it was being offered to him freely, without condition, by the people who had defeated his country. Private Carson nudged a serving platter toward him. "Turkey, sir? White meat or dark?" Hans looked at the perfectly roasted bird, at the care that had gone into its preparation, at the young American private waiting patiently for his response. He thought about Sergeant Washington's question in the kitchen. Is that warfare or just truth? Hans picked up the serving fork. "Both," he said quietly, taking a slice of white meat. I'll try both. November 24th, 1944. 3 o'clock sharp. Hans placed the turkey on his plate, then added sweet potatoes, green beans, dressing, and a roll. The plate was heavier than any he'd held in years. Around him, the awkward silence of the first few minutes was giving way to tentative conversation. Private Carson was attempting to explain American football using a dinner roll and salt shaker as props. Fritz was engaged in a halting discussion with an American corporal about their respective hometowns. Hans cut a piece of turkey and brought it to his mouth. The taste stopped him completely. It was perfect. The meat was tender and juicy, seasoned with exactly the right balance of salt and herbs. The butter he'd watched them rub under the skin had done its work, keeping every fibre moist. The exterior had that ideal combination of crispy skin and rendered fat. This was professional cooking, expert technique applied with care and respect for the ingredient. "Good, isn't it?" Sergeant Washington said, appearing beside the table. "Sergeant Miller's been cooking Thanksgiving turkey for 20 years. He knows what he's doing." Hans swallowed. "It's exceptional. The temperature control, the basting schedule, the resting time before carving, all perfect." Washington smiled. "You sound like you're evaluating a restaurant kitchen." "I can't help it. It's what I know." Hans took another bite, this time with some of the dressing. The combination of sage, onion, and celery complemented the turkey perfectly. Simple, traditional, expertly executed. He thought about Klaus sitting in the barracks, refusing this meal on principle. Was the young man right? Was accepting this food a betrayal of German dignity? Or was refusing it a betrayal of something more fundamental? The human capacity to recognize when an enemy extends an honest hand. Private Carson nudged him and pointed to the sweet potatoes. "Try those. My mama makes them just like this back home." Hans took a small portion. The sweetness was almost overwhelming after years of bland rations, but beneath it he could taste the nutmeg, the cinnamon, the butter. Layers of flavor that spoke to generations of tradition. "Your mother taught you to cook?" Hans asked. "Yes, sir. She says food is how we show love. Can't tell someone you care about them on an empty stomach." Hans looked around the dining area. 93 German prisoners seated among American soldiers and staff. Conversations happening in broken English and broken German. Laughter occasionally cutting through the November cold. This wasn't psychological warfare. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't even really about Thanksgiving. It was about the simple act of feeding people, of recognizing hunger and responding to it, of maintaining humanity in circumstances that made humanity difficult. Hans finished his turkey and reached for seconds. Not because he'd been won over, not because he'd forgotten he was a prisoner, but because sometimes accepting kindness was the bravest thing a proud man could do. Across the compound, through barracks windows, he knew Klaus was watching. Fritz caught his eye and nodded slightly. November 24th, 1944, 3:15 in the afternoon. Hans took his third bite of turkey, this time more slowly, more analytically. The flavor wasn't just about the meat itself. It was about everything that surrounded it. The tradition behind the preparation, the care taken in execution, the intention to share rather than to display. He tried the cranberry sauce, tart and sweet, cutting through the richness of the turkey. Then the mashed potatoes, creamy and smooth, with just enough butter to make them luxurious without being heavy. Each component had been prepared with competence and respect. This wasn't elaborate cuisine designed to impress. It was honest food, well executed, meant to nourish and comfort. In Germany, Hans said to Sergeant Washington, who had returned to check on the table, we have a saying, Liebe geht durch den Magen. Love goes through the stomach. We say something similar, Washington replied. The way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Hans nodded slowly. I spent years managing a restaurant. I thought I understood food, but I always approached it as business, as craft, as art, perhaps. I never considered it as, he struggled to find the right word in English. As connection, Washington offered. Yes, as connection between people who might otherwise have nothing in common. Hans looked down at his plate, half empty now, or half full, depending on perspective. This turkey, he said quietly, is better than anything I've tasted in 5 years. Not because of the ingredients or the technique, though both are excellent, but because it was given freely, without condition, without expectation of gratitude or submission. He met Washington's eyes. That's what I couldn't see yesterday. That generosity and strength aren't opposites. That you can be powerful enough to defeat us and kind enough to feed us. Washington smiled. Now you understand Thanksgiving, Obergefreiter Müller. Hans took another bite. No, he said honestly, but I'm learning. November 24th, 1944, 8 o'clock in the evening. Hans stood outside Barracks 7, his stomach uncomfortably full. The dinner had lasted nearly 3 hours, followed by coffee and pumpkin pie that he'd eaten despite feeling he couldn't possibly manage another bite. The door to Barracks 5 opened. Klaus Zimmermann emerged, followed by 2 of the men who had maintained the boycott. Hans tensed, expecting confrontation. Klaus walked directly to him, stopping a few feet away. In the lamplight, the young man looked tired rather than angry. How was the turkey? Klaus asked quietly. Hans considered lying, softening the truth. But dishonesty had caused enough problems already. It was excellent, he said. Professionally prepared. Generous portions, no conditions attached. Klaus nodded slowly. And do you feel like less of a German soldier now? The question wasn't hostile, it was genuine. No, Hans said after consideration. But I don't feel like more of one either. I feel like a man who ate a good meal prepared by other men who treated me with respect I didn't expect. 24 of us stayed in the barracks, Klaus said. By 6 o'clock, half of them were asking if there were any leftovers. Hans smiled slightly. Were there? Sergeant Washington came by. Said there was plenty if anyone changed their mind. No judgment, no questions, just food. Did anyone go? 8 men, including Peter Hoffmann. Klaus looked at his boots. I didn't. Why not? Klaus was quiet for a long moment. Because if I go now, it means I was wrong, and I'm not ready to admit that yet. Hans understood completely. You weren't wrong to maintain your principles, Klaus. You made a different choice than I did. That doesn't make either of us right or wrong. But you changed your mind, Klaus pointed out. You organized the boycott, then abandoned it. I didn't abandon it. I revised my position based on new information. That's not weakness, that's intelligence. Klaus looked up. Then why do I feel weak for wanting to have gone? The vulnerability in the question caught Hans off guard. This wasn't the angry young soldier from the afternoon. This was a confused young man trying to navigate impossible circumstances. Because it's easier to maintain certainty than to admit complexity, Hans said. I spent years believing I understood food, that it was about technique and presentation and profit. Today, I learned that sometimes it's just about feeding people who are hungry. Even enemies? Especially enemies. Because that's how enemies stop being enemies. Klaus shook his head. I still think you're wrong, Hans. I think accepting their hospitality obligates us to them. Maybe you're right, Hans acknowledged. Maybe in a year, when we're repatriated, I'll regret attending. But tonight, I'm grateful I did. Klaus nodded and turned to leave. Then he stopped. Sergeant Washington said the leftovers would be available tomorrow for anyone who wants them. Are you going to eat them? Hans asked. I don't know yet, Klaus said honestly, but I'm thinking about it. He walked back to his barracks, leaving Hans alone in the cold November night. December 1st, 1944, 1 week later. Hans walked into the camp kitchen, carrying a notebook. Sergeant Washington looked up from his prep station and smiled. Obergefreiter Müller, you're early for lunch service. I'm not here to eat, Hans said. I'm here to work, if you'll have me. Washington set down his knife. Work? You showed me your Thanksgiving techniques. I'd like to show you some German cooking methods. An exchange, professional to professional. Washington studied him carefully. What brought this on? Hans opened the notebook, revealing pages of handwritten recipes in German. I've been thinking about what you said. That food carries history. That we cook it to remember where we came from. He paused. If I'm going to be here until the war ends, I don't want to forget how to cook the dishes my grandfather taught me. And you want to teach them to Americans. I want to teach them to anyone who wants to learn, before I forget them completely. Washington nodded slowly, then extended his hand. Welcome to the kitchen, Hans. Over the following weeks, Hans became a regular presence in the camp kitchen. He taught the American cooks how to make sauerbraten, spätzle, and proper German potato salad. In return, they taught him southern biscuits, fried chicken, and cornbread variations he'd never imagined. Klaus Zimmermann never attended another organized meal, but Hans sometimes saw him in the kitchen late at night, quietly eating leftovers while reading a book. They never spoke about Thanksgiving again. The resistance committee dissolved without formal announcement. Some men, like Fritz, became regular participants in camp activities. Others, like Klaus, maintained their distance while no longer actively organizing opposition. Hans never forgot that he was a prisoner, but he also never forgot that Sergeant Washington had treated him as a colleague when he could have treated him as an enemy. It was a lesson that would stay with him long after the war ended. Sometimes, the bravest thing a man can do isn't refusing kindness, it's accepting it. Hans Müller learned that lesson on a cold November day in Alabama, when American enemies proved more generous than German propaganda had allowed him to believe. The turkey was just turkey, but what it represented, the possibility that pride and principle aren't always the same thing, stayed with him for the rest of his life. Some lessons can only be learned at a table.